Hi, welcome to another episode of First Chapter Friday. My name is Lucy, and the book that I am going to be sharing with you today is a little bit older than some of the books I usually do. It was written in 2011, so not so long ago, but not really new. And the reason that I am reading from this book today is that I was so pleasantly surprised by what this book is. It was not what I had expected. It's a book I've seen on the shelves for years, and based on the cover, I sort of thought it was this one thing, and it was really so much more than that for me. So the book is Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children by Ransom. And some of you may be familiar with this. There's a whole series of them. Some of you may have read it, but based on what I had seen of it before, I just thought it was a book about weird and peculiar children. Sort of a real fantasy book in that vein. And it is about that in some way, but it is also about so much more. It starts with the story of a 16-year-old, Jacob Portman, who is really close with his grandfather. It's his current day, non-fantastical times. And his grandfather's been telling him these stories all his life about these children that he lived with on this home in Wales. His grandfather was removed from Poland as a child right at during World War II, and he lived in this children's home in Wales. And he has pictures of all these really strange kids who could levitate and who have eyes on the back of their head and things like that. And Jacob's always sort of bought into that, but as he gets older, he starts to question it. What I thought was a really interesting piece was based on the grandfather's history, is the idea that, his grandfather always talked about being chased by monsters too, and he was scared of monsters. But if you think about where the grandfather came from, Poland, as a Jewish refugee child during World War II, in fact, there were maybe monsters that were chasing him. So it's a really interesting interplay between historical fact and what a child's mind might do with the world around them. So that was one part that instantly drew me in. Jacob is a great and interesting character just as a regular teen boy. I really liked his voice, and so that just pulled me into the story as well. So Jacob has something happen in the beginning of the book that is tough for him, and he sort of goes through his own personal struggle and really gets into kind of a dark place, and he ends up in Wales with his father for the summer. His father is a big birder, and he's going to be studying birds in Wales. And Jacob decides to go with him because he needs to do something. His life as it is at home right now is untenable for him. So that's how they get to Wales, and that is where the story of Miss Peregrine and her home and the peculiar children unfold. So there is definitely a very fantastical element there. But Ransom, the author, does a wonderful job of sort of going back and forth between the real world and this fantastical world. And it makes you think about questions like a relationship between mental illness and paranormal activity. Like, what is real in your brain? What is not? So I just felt that this was a really original book, which a lot of people probably already knew. It defies categorization, and it's really hard to put it in one genre. I thought, as I said, I loved Jacob. His grandfather was an interesting character. The people he meets in Wales, very interesting. So it's really full of so much. And if you think you don't like fantasy, I would recommend this as something to jump into it, because it does have that sort of real world part of it as well. I'm excited to have finished this, and I'm looking forward to continuing on with the rest of the series. So I will now read to you the first chapter. It's actually the prologue, not chapter 1, of Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. I had just come to accept that my life would be ordinary when extraordinary things began to happen. The first of these came as a terrible shock and, like anything that changes you forever, split my life into halves, before and after. Like many of the extraordinary things to come, it involved my grandfather, Abraham Portman. Growing up, Grandpa Portman was the most fascinating person I knew. He had lived in an orphanage, fought in wars, crossed oceans by steamship and deserts on horseback, performed in circuses, knew everything about guns and self-defense and surviving in the wilderness, and spoke at least 3 languages that weren't English. It all seemed unfathomably exotic to a kid who'd never left Florida. And I begged him to regale me with stories whenever I saw him. He always obliged, telling them like secrets that could be entrusted only to me. When I was 6, I decided that my only chance of having a life half as exciting as Grandpa Portman's was to become an explorer. He encouraged me by spending afternoons at my side, hunched over maps of the world, plotting imaginary expeditions with trails of red pushpins, and telling me about the fantastic places I would discover one day. At home, I made my ambitions known by parading around with a cardboard tube held to my eye, shouting, "Land ho!" and "Prepare a landing party," until my parents shooed me outside. I think they worried that my grandfather would infect me with some incurable dreaminess from which I'd never recover, that these fantasies were somehow inoculating me against more practical ambitions. So one day, my mother sat me down and explained that I couldn't become an explorer because everything in the world had already been discovered. I'd been born in the wrong century, and I felt cheated. I felt even more cheated when I realized that most of Grandpa Portman's best stories couldn't possibly be true. The tallest tales were always about his childhood, like how he was born in Poland, but at 12 had been shipped off to a children's home in Wales. When I asked why he had to leave his parents, his answer was always the same. Because the monsters were after him. Poland was simply rotten with them, he said. What kind of monsters, I'd ask, wide-eyed. It became a sort of routine. Awful, hunched over ones with rotting skin and black eyes, he'd say, and they walked like this. And he'd shamble after me like an old-time movie monster until I ran away laughing. Every time he described them, he'd toss in some lurid new detail. They stank like putrefying trash. They were invisible except for their shadows. A pack of squirming tentacles lurked inside their mouths and could whip out in an instant and pull you into their powerful jaws. It wasn't long before I had trouble falling asleep, my hyperactive imagination transforming the hiss of tires on wet pavement into labored breathing just outside my windows, or shadows under the door into twisting black-gray tentacles. I was scared of the monsters, but thrilled to imagine my grandfather battling them and surviving to tell their tale. More fantastic still were his stories about life in the Welsh children's home. It was an enchanted place, he said, designed to keep kids safe from the monsters, on an island where the sun shined every day and nobody ever got sick or died. Everyone lived together in a big house that was protected by a wise old bird, or so the story went. As I got older, though, I began to have doubts. What kind of bird? I asked him one afternoon at age 7, eyeing him skeptically across the card table where he was letting me win at Monopoly. A big hawk who smoked a pipe, he said. You must think I'm pretty dumb, Grandpa. He thumbed through his dwindling stack of orange and blue money. I would never think that about you, Jakob. I knew I'd offended him because the Polish accent he could never quite shake had come out of hiding, so that would became would and think became sink. Feeling guilty, I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt. But why did the monsters want to hurt you? I asked. Because we weren't like other people. We were peculiar. Peculiar how? Oh, all sorts of ways, he said. There was a girl who could fly, a boy who had bees living inside him, a brother and sister who could lift boulders over their heads. It was hard to tell if he was being serious. Then again, my grandfather was not known as a teller of jokes. He frowned, reading the doubt on my face. Fine, you don't have to take my word for it, he said. I got pictures. He pushed back his lawn chair and went into the house, leaving me alone on the screened-in lanai. A minute later, he came back holding an old cigar box. I leaned in to look as he drew out 4 wrinkled and yellowing snapshots. The first was a blurry picture of what looked like a suit of clothes with no person in them. Either that or the person didn't have a head. Sure, he's got a head, my grandfather said, grinning, only you can't see it. Why not? Is he invisible? Hey, look at the brain on this one. He raised his eyebrows as if I'd surprised him with my powers of deduction. Millard, his name was. Funny kid. Sometimes he'd say, hey, Abe, I know what you did today. And then he'd tell you where you'd been, what you'd had to eat, if you picked your nose when you thought nobody was looking. Sometimes he'd follow you quiet as a mouse with no clothes on so you couldn't see him, just watching. He shook his head. Of all the things, eh? He slipped me another photo. Once I'd had a moment to look at it, he said, "So, what do you see? A little girl? And she's wearing a crown?" He tapped the bottom of the picture. "What about her feet?" I held the snapshot closer. The girl's feet weren't touching the ground, but she wasn't jumping. She seemed to be floating in the air. My jaw fell open. "She's flying." "Close," my grandfather said. "She's levitating. Only she couldn't control herself too well, so sometimes we had to tie a rope around her to keep her from floating away." My eyes were glued to her haunting doll-like face. "Is it real?" "Of course it is," he said gruffly, taking the picture and replacing it with another, this one of a scrawny boy lifting a boulder. "Victor and his sister weren't so smart," he said, "but boy, were they strong." "He doesn't look strong," I said, studying the boy's skinny arms. "Trust me, he was. I tried to arm wrestle him once and he just about tore my hand off." But the strangest photo was the last one. It was the back of somebody's head with a face painted on it. I stared at the last photo. As Grandpa Portman explained, he had two mouths, see? One in the front and one in the back. That's why he got so big and fat. "But it's fake," I said. "The face is just painted on." "Sure, the paint's fake. It was for a circus show, but I'm telling you, he had two mouths. You don't believe me?" I thought about it, looking at the pictures and then at my grandfather, his face so earnest and open. What reason would he have to lie? "I believe you," I said. And I really did believe him, for a few years at least, though mostly because I wanted to, like other kids my age wanted to believe in Santa Claus. We cling to our fairy tales until the price for believing them becomes too high, which for me was the day in second grade when Robbie Jensen pantsed me at lunch in front of a table of girls and announced that I believed in fairies. It was just desserts, I suppose, for repeating my grandfather's stories at school, but in those humiliating seconds, I foresaw the moniker Fairy Boy trailing me for years, and rightly or not, I resented him for it. Grandpa Portman picked me up from school that afternoon, as he often did when both my parents were working. I climbed into the passenger seat of his old Pontiac and declared that I didn't believe in his fairy stories anymore. "What fairy stories?" he said, peering at me over his glasses. "You know, the stories about the kids and the monsters." He seemed confused. "Who said anything about fairies?" I told him that a made-up story and a fairy tale were the same thing, and that fairy tales were for pants-wetting babies, and that I knew his photos and stories were fake. I expected him to get mad or put up a fight, but instead he just said, "Okay," and threw the Pontiac into drive. With a stab of his foot on the accelerator, we lurched away from the curb, and that was the end of it. I guess he'd seen it coming. I had to grow out of them eventually, but he dropped the whole thing so quickly, it left me feeling like I'd been lied to. I couldn't understand why he made up all that stuff, tricked me into believing that extraordinary things were possible when they weren't. It wasn't until a few years later that my dad explained it to me. Grandpa had told him some of the same stories when he was a kid, and they weren't lies exactly, but exaggerated versions of the truth, because the story of Grandpa Portman's childhood wasn't a fairy tale at all. It was a horror story. My grandfather was the only member of his family to escape Poland before the Second World War broke out. He was 12 years old when his parents sent him into the arms of strangers, putting their youngest son on a train to Britain with nothing more than a suitcase and the clothes on his back. It was a one-way ticket. He never saw his mother or father again, or his older brothers, his cousins, his aunts, and uncles. Each one would be dead before his 16th birthday, killed by the monsters he had so narrowly escaped. But these weren't the kind of monsters that had tentacles and rotting skin, the kind of 7-year-old might be able to wrap his mind around. They were monsters with human faces in crisp uniforms, marching in lockstep, so banal you don't recognize them for what they are until it's too late. Like the monsters, the Enchanted Island story was also a truth in disguise. Compared to the horrors of mainland Europe, The children's home that had taken in my grandfather must have seemed like a paradise. And so in his stories, it had become one, a safe haven of endless summers and guardian angels and magical children who couldn't really fly or turn invisible or lift boulders, of course. The peculiarity for which they'd been hunted was simply their Jewishness. They were orphans of war, washed up on that little island in a tide of blood. What made them amazing wasn't that they had miraculous powers. That they had escaped the ghettos and gas chambers was miracle enough. I stopped asking my grandfather to tell me stories, and I think secretly he was relieved. An air of mystery closed around the details of his early life. I didn't pry. He had been through hell and had a right to his secrets. I felt ashamed for having been jealous of his life, considering the price he'd paid for it. And I tried to feel lucky for the safe and unextraordinary one that I had done nothing to deserve. Then, a few years later, when I was 15, an extraordinary and terrible thing happened. And there was only before and after. And that is the end of the prologue of Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. So if that doesn't pull you in, I don't know. I mean, I think right there, right off the bat, you're getting that kind of mix of these fantastical tales with some real horrible history that's interesting. You can see that Jacob's mind is working in some pretty deep ways, and it's quite a journey to see where it leads him. So if you have not read this book, I highly recommend Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children by Ransom Riggs. I am really looking forward to getting further in the series. Thanks for joining me.